Alright, welcome to the second part of getting a good full mix. I hope you enjoyed the last video, and if you have any questions you can ask me about that. That can be very complicated. But the basic concepts are very simple. And same here, I'm going to point out some basic concepts, and they can get very complicated. They can be different in different situations, and it can be very experimental. In one production it may not work as well as within another production, and especially in this part of stereo field. I'm building your stereo field. It can be a huge problem. Phase can be an issue. You really have to watch out for phase. A prime example of that is delays, reverbs, things like anything that's adding any type of delay in space. That you have to really get it in your head that you're not dealing with three-dimensional binaural sound. You're dealing with stereo. So when you get, this over here on this side, and you've got a different reverb on the other side or a different delay on it, that, in one production, the delay between one side and the other will sound fine. And in another production on a different instrument, you might get phase issues. And, it's not like you got a chorus going on or something. You're like, what the heck's going on? You really have to watch out for that with any of this stuff that we're talking about. That can be a huge thing. And normally when I'm dealing with this kind of stuff, two things that I really have to watch out for is phase. When you start messing around with the reverbs that we're going to talk about in a moment, and you start messing around different delays on different double tracks and things like that, putting delay on something and then panning over to one side and then doubling it, put it on the other side and putting a different delay on it, that kind of, you got to be real careful about phase. You'll start to hear it, it'll start to sound funky, and you'll be just like, funky's the best word that I can come up with, because it just sounds funky, bro. What's going on? It sounds starting to sound tinny. I've got a phaser on it or something. What's going on? Those are huge issues. The other issue to deal with is when we're dealing with detunings to make it sound fuller. Those can be huge issues, and you really got to listen to that. You just got to take your time, and the more work you do, you just got to sit back and go, is that sounding okay in the production? Oh, and you might have to go back and go, well, it sounded good when I was working on those guitars, but now when I got it mixed in the mix, how does it sound now? Is it causing phase with another instrument? I've done all this work on these other instruments, and then I start mixing them together with all the stereo field work I've done. Are they causing issues with each other? Does that make sense? And you might have detuning issues. You may have phase issues, volume issues, those kind of things. So it's a process of going through it. If somebody tells you that you're going to make some phenomenal thing and the mix is just going to go like that and it's done, I don't believe that. Sometimes you might get lucky and do something real simple and it come out sounding pretty good. But if you really want to spend the time to really work on these things to get that full, beautiful, perfect mix, that it's not that simple. It's just not. You're going to spend time on it. And if you're new at it or intermediate, you may spend hours. You may spend a month. You might spend 2 months on some production screwing around with the detuning and the phase problems and trying to pan it. And all the stuff that we're talking about, you might even mess with it for months. Listen, it is complicated. Once you understand the simple concepts and the more you work with them, the simpler it gets. But audio engineering is a very complicated thing. It just is. Acoustics are very complicated. Research acoustics. The word acoustics and what all is involved with that. It's very complicated. And the math gets very complicated. And if you're mixing, a lot of times you might not be dealing with a lot of that math. But trust me, it's happening. Look up the fast Fourier transform and how that works. It's complicated, bro. And when you start putting reverb and delays and all kinds of other kind of stuff that's going on, that you've got, a whole lot of mathematical crap going on that's trying to mix together, that it's very complex. So, but I'm going to try to make this real simple for this next part of this getting a good full mix, so that these basic concepts are very simple to understand, so that when you start messing with this or you're wondering about it, that the concepts can be very simple. The first thing I want to deal with is miking. Okay, now I myself, a lot of times I'll take one capture. With one microphone, I don't sit around with 10 microphones trying to capture some guitar with some acoustic crap all over the place. I just don't. I want a good tone. I'll double that track and I'll start working on my spatialization. And I will EQ one of them different. I will put different. I'll do all kinds of stuff on the good capture that I have of that guitar. But you can spend days while I've got one microphone, you know, right here at my fretboard, one a little bit back by the sound hole, one up ahead of me, one off to the side, and one over there back behind the piano, bro. And when I got done recording this, it sounded awesome, dude. You know, and it's like, all right, dude, that's cool. You know, I mean, you can have a lot of fun with it, and I'm not deterring you from that because, I mean, you can do a lot of stuff with that, and it's really cool. But I'm going to deal with basics, and miking and doing things like that, I'm not going to deal with that at all. All that works out to is spatialization and delays and different tones, because if you've got the guitar and it's mic'd a little bit different, up the neck farther, back towards the sound hole, you might get a little bit different sound, but what you're going to, you know, at best, what you're going to hear is some different characteristics of the guitar, which can be cool, and you do want to mess around with that. But you'll find that once you get a good sound out of it, that, you know, and you've mic'd it correctly to where you want it, and you've got the mic position, having 12 different mics on there to try to get all these other nuances of it, you may not want to get too deep into that, you know, and not, you know, get lost in that because I did. And I'd be like, have 12 mics around my acoustic guitar, bro, and I'd be like, this is ridiculous, bro, I can't even move. You know what I'm saying? That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. So let's deal with some simple concepts. The first simple concept we want is a good clean capture that's in time, the performance is done well, and you've got a good sound. Does that make sense? Bottom line, you know, if you can get that, you know, working with it from that point with the things we're talking about is going to be so nice. Okay, bro? So really work on that, you know. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is doubling tracks. Okay, spatialization, we're talking about panning left to right. There is no binaural, it's stereo. Okay, we already talked about that. So, I mean, you've got stereo to work with. And one key thing that I've found that I will point out is if I pan everything 100%, that something sounds funky, bro. For some reason, I've come back to sometimes 98% right or left or 95% right or left, and it just sounds better. So experiment with that. I do not know what the mathematical cause of that is and why that's happening. I really don't. I mean, I don't know. I've just messed around with it, and I've found that if it's all the way 100% right and left, it sounds way too far right and left unless my production has got a lot of instruments and it's a large production, sometimes symphonic or something like that, and I can get away with it. Otherwise, I bring them in most of the time a little bit. So keep that in mind. That's a tip that I've learned. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is spatialization. One of the first things I do when I've got, we'll talk about a guitar. We'll talk about vocals and some other things, but I've got a guitar track and I've recorded this section and it's done perfect. I'm happy with it. I've got a good capture, a good performance, in time well, and I mic'd it well, and I've got a good sound. I mean, it's a good sound and good capture. It's recorded. It's done. Okay, so the first thing that I'm looking at is that, you know, one of the first things is we'll address EQ. Okay, so you've spent all this time trying to get it, and you've got two different captures, one out of your DI and one out of one mic and out of a different mic to try and get these different things. Well, I've found that a really cool thing to do is I'll get a good capture, I'll pan one off to one side a little bit, one off to the other, and I'll EQ one and the other one a little bit different. One of them I'll be accenting the high end a little bit more, one side I'll be accenting the low end a little bit more with the EQ or something like that. And I'll have one maybe in the middle. If it's just a solo guitar, I'll be accenting the mid-range a little bit more in that area. Somewhere where the acoustic guitar sounds good. Does that make sense? That's a huge concept to get in your head for spatialization. It really is helpful. And you will find out you spend a lot less time miking all kinds of different ways. With that simple concept will save you a lot of time. And I'm not going to get real complicated in that, just that simple concept, and that should be very easy for you to understand. So the EQ thing is huge, and doing that anytime you're panning off things one side or the other. Okay, so you cue them a little bit different, give it a little bit different sound, and it adds character to the mix and makes it sound fuller. Sometimes there's been times I haven't, but sometimes I do, and you have to experiment with that and to really see where that's going with that, but understand why. Does that make sense? I've got one microphone out in front of my guitar. I've got one microphone up high or somewhere else, and I'm getting different frequency responses from it. And, the other stuff as far as acoustics, room acoustics, we'll talk about, but that's just, different tonalities. And you can deal with a whole lot of that with just an EQ. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is doubling your track. Okay, so real simple, we've got this guitar. And if you look here, there's different pannings. I've got, you can pan different instruments at different areas to try to give more space in the stereo field. Like I've got the guitars doubled at 50, I've got the bass doubled at 30 or something like that to give it more space, 30 right, 30 left. I've got the piano doubled at 75% right and left, one doubled off to the right, one off to the left is 75%, then maybe, the vocals are out at 80% right and left, and dot, 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 on and on like that. That's a huge concept to understand, and that takes experimentation. I'm not going to give you some formula that's the way you do it with every composition, because it might not work on this composition. It might work on that one. It might not work on that one. And you might want it panned a little bit different the way you want it to sound. So that's something you have to experiment with. So that panning thing is huge. All right, the other thing is dynamics, louder and softer. That's a huge thing to understand about spatialization, is you really have to just sit down and spend a lot of time trying to understand, okay, I've got this guitar and, I've panned them off right and left and I've doubled them and they sound pretty good, but they need a little bit lower end, but I don't want to mess with it too much. So I've made 4 tracks of this guitar, bro. I really have. And on the right and left, I've got them to where they're panned off to one side or the other. I've got one side EQ'd a little bit differently, or I didn't. And I want to put another track on there that's the guitars that's got a little bit higher, brassier sound. That's got this a nice, really high brassy sound. So I'll EQ it differently, and then I'll bring those tracks up underneath it really lightly until it starts to fill in the sound of that acoustic. Because I got that good acoustic sound, but it sounds like it really needs that, and I'll start working with that kind of stuff. And that's a really huge dynamics thing, bringing things up underneath that and giving themselves front to back so that, they're not, so that it adds some depth. And you will be surprised that those other tracks add depth. Not just panning, spatialization, that stereo sound, but depth also. And that kind of stuff, bringing stuff up underneath stuff you've already worked on and doubling those tracks and EQ them a little bit different, a little bit more bass end on it, a little more mid-range or a little bit of high end or something like that, or whatever, think you might need to sound good, and bringing it up lightly and way in the background. It gives it space. I mean, if you got good speakers and you're listening to it, it adds depth. So really, and with vocals, any kind of instrument, it can add a lot of depth, that kind of stuff. So that's another very simple concept to get into your head to use. So remember that. The next thing, we're going to talk about delays. Now, I'm going to go back a step really quick because I learned a really important lesson that let's say I'm recording a vocalist, and the vocalist wants a little bit of reverb on there, so I need to hear himself sing. So I'll put a little reverb on there so it sounds like got some space or whatever, if I'm not in a big studio or something. And, so that it sounds, cool to him, and it's like, yeah, that sounds good. Sounds like a good room, and I can hear myself, and I sound just so smooth, bro. It gets his mojo going or something, whatever. That's cool, yeah, bro. I can understand that. So, but I don't print it on the track. I won't record it with them. I'll put it on there, but I won't actually record it with that reverb on there so that it's nice and dry when I start working on it. And what I've learned to do is I'll take a series of delays and reverbs. I'll pick a nice, really soft room reverb that's not really overpowering, that's got a good, it's got a good frequency response and a good impulse response. It's not too huge of a space. And I'll put it on that track. I'll render that track, bounce that track with that on there so light you can't even hear it. You start to notice a little bit of reverb on it, I'll turn it up till you can notice, and then I back way off. I mean, to where it's like you can't really hear anything's on there, but if you take it off there, you'll notice that a little bit of spatialization has gone off that vocal, and I will render it like that. I'll bounce that track like that, to where you can't hardly even hear anything was done. You would never know that I put reverb on there or anything like that. And I'll do the same thing with delays. Now, it sounds like a lot of processing, but I've learned that it really adds some body to what I'm doing next. And I'll put a series of delays on there, and we'll talk about delays, that add just a little bit of body on there, that, just a little bit of delay on it, not much, really quick milliseconds, and I'll bring it up underneath there. When we're talking about delays, you have the threshold of the Haas effect, which is going to start sounding like it's doubling, rather than just body, right? So understand the Haas effect. If you don't understand it, look it up. There's probably a video on my channel about it. And multiples of the Haas effect. Multiples of the Haas effect meaning half of the milliseconds that it takes before it starts doubling, and then you can quarter that. So you have 4 separate different millisecond intervals that you can work with. That's where I normally go first. So I'll go, let's say it's 36 is where it starts to sound like doubling in my studio. So I'll try that, see how that sounds. I'll go to half of that, I'll go to a quarter of that, and I'll go to 3/4 of that first of all to see how that sounds. And sometimes when I'm using my delays, that I'll use all 4 of them, if it's not causing too much phase issue, on 4 separate delays on there, and just really lightly, where you can't even hear it. You don't hardly know anything's happened, and I'll render it and bounce it like that. And it just adds some body before I actually start working on it. And when I say barely, I mean that barely you can't really notice anything's happened to it all, but just a little bit. Because I learned when I start working, I start separating around and I start doing different delays and stuff we're going to talk about, that it adds some body to it. Gives it a little bit more girth, a little more body, a little more impact for when I start actually working with it. All right, so the next step is we've got it panned. So real good example, I've got one guitar panned right. I've got the guitar track. I've got it. It's done, and I've got one side where I've left it alone. The other side I've EQ'd a little bit differently, and I've boosted the high end a little bit to give it a little bit higher brassy sound. Or I didn't. I left them both the same. Okay, so delays is those multiples we were talking about. I'll say, okay, that one on the right hand side, I got no delay on it. The other side, I'm going to put 36 milliseconds on it. On my DAW, it's 36.6 milliseconds before it really starts sounding like it's doubling. And then I'll sit back and listen to it, see how it goes. Now, one thing to get in your head about everything we're talking about, that you can spend a lot of time on this instrument. When you start mixing all the other instruments together, it's going to take time. There's no way to just say, well, that's going to work for this production. That isn't. When you start mixing all those instruments together, after you've done all these work on these separate instruments, you may have to adjust those things. All of a sudden, you might be having an issue with that, and I might have to change the delay on that because it's causing an issue in the production. I'm getting phase problems or something like that. So you have to understand all this work can cause you a whole bunch more problems later that you have to deal with. But that's part of audio engineering, because it's just like sound sculpting. You get a synthesizer, some wild synthesizer that's got every knob in the world on it, that it takes work. You're trying to sculpt this sound, it may take you a long time, and every time you're sculpting this sound, because the production is a bunch of sinusoids that make one complex waveform. So you're basically trying to sculpt this sound wave like a synthesizer, is basically what comes out. If you look at an oscilloscope at your production and your mix, it's one sine wave, it's one waveform, and so you're trying to sculpt that just like a synthesizer effect. So you have to kind of look at it that way, and as you start mixing them together, you might have more work to do. So try to keep that in your head. I try to make that simple, but it's just not. I mean, sometimes it can just goes together just like butter, bro. And sometimes it just doesn't. You know, there's been a few times I just be like, bro, if I gotta look at this one more time, I'm just, you know, I can't tell. I've been messing with this violin for I don't know how long, bro, and I just gotta walk away, you know, because it just something doesn't sound right, or I have to change the cello, or I have to bring the volume down. I gotta do something, or EQ it different, or some dang thing, or put a different delay on it, or put a different reverb on it. Something's going on, and it ain't mixed in well with everything else. So keep that in mind. So anyway, you've got that happening. Now, those delays are a huge thing. Putting delay on from what you've got, you've doubled those tracks or made two separate recordings of that guitar take, which some people will say to do that. Some people will say, okay, you want to do that? You take one record one guitar take of that section or that song, and then you do it again, a separate take, and then you pan one side off to the right or the other. But you got to be careful of that because those performances won't be exactly the same, and that may cause you issues. Whereas this is very mathematical and very exact rather than that, and then you start dealing with other issues that may be happening in one section but not another section because of the way the guy was playing in the second take. So be real careful of that. So now we've got the delays. Now you might find out one thing to remember about delays. I've got bass drums. Here's a good example. Bass drum, I hardly never make a double of that pan any dang where. But there's been a couple times I did, and I learned a real hard lesson about bass drums is you can't hardly put no dang delay on it and it starts sounding like crap so fast it's not even funny. I'd be messing around. How do I get 1/1000th of a second of delay on there? Just add a little body, because I'm anal about it. I want it to sound awesome, bro. And it's like, those and bass, and some instruments will sound, you'll be sitting there and I'll go half of that 36 milliseconds on this violin, pan it off to one side or the other. I double the track, one's over here, one over here, at 18.3 millisecond delay on the left, and the other one doesn't have no delay. And that sounds good. But if I put it at the quarter of the Haas effect, it sounds phasey. But if I pump it up, it's like 12.2 or something, and I go up to 12.3, all of a sudden the phase issue disappears. That's something you just got to mess with, but that can happen. So delaying that one side and the other can have a huge effect. And also going to have a huge effect wall of sound with delays is you've got no delay. You've doubled the track 4 times. You've got no delay on the right hand side, the first one. On the left hand side, you've got 36 milliseconds, right underneath the threshold of the Haas effect. Back on the right hand side, you have another track that one's got delay that's half of the Haas effect, half of the Haas threshold, which is like 18 milliseconds. And then over on the left, you've got that one with delay on it that's somewhere around a quarter of it, maybe 12 milliseconds or something like that. And you've worked on it a little bit up and down, 12.2, 12.5, maybe 11, 11.6, until you got rid of any phase issues happening. So you're not hearing any kind of phase stuff. And that guitar was panned off. One of them was 50% right, 50% left. One was 75% right, one was 75% left, like that. Wall of sound. Okay, so that can be very expensive. I'm just trying to put the simple concepts out there so that you can experiment with them. I'm not trying to give you some formula that it's just going to be, that's the way I do it. You really have to experiment with that. But you will find, even if you just take your guitar apart and you've never experimented with this and you double the track, one over the right, one over the left, and put it underneath the Haas effect, like 36 milliseconds, 35 milliseconds, you're going to notice a huge stereo impact on your mix immediately. And if you do that with all the instruments that you're doing and you get through all the phase issues or any problems that you're having while you're listening to it, you'll notice a huge impact on the fullness and the full sound of your mix. Be real careful with drums anytime you're putting delays on drums, bro. Drums can be a pain in the butt. You start messing with delays on drums and reverbs and stuff, go light, bro, because I'm telling you, I'll end up with a muddy ass mess, and I just be going, oh man, I learned to be real careful with drums. Okay, so that's delay. Delay is really simple. So the next thing we're going to talk about is detuning. Okay, so with those two guitars, I've got that one that I've recorded off to the right hand side. The one on the left, I've detuned in my DAW by 3 cents. Okay, 3 cents. 100 cents is a semitone. So I've detuned it 3 cents. That is huge. That's a symphonic that's a symphonic lesson, detuning. Okay, because, and you can also tune up a little bit, up 3 cents, up 6 cents. Anything above 6 cents, be careful. I've gotten it up to 9 a couple times, plus or minus 9 cents, but then I start having, it sounds like it's not in tune. So be real careful with that. That's about the threshold that I normally work within. But it's a symphonic effect. All you've got all these violins over here, bro. Well, they're all in tuned to standard temperament tuning, but they're all going to be a little bit out of tune from each other. Maybe a cent, maybe 2 cents, maybe 3 cents, maybe 4 cents, sometimes even 5 or 6 cents from the other violins in there, depending on how good the musicians are. They're going to be a little bit out of tune each other, and it adds body. Trust me, it adds body. It's a huge lesson to learn from symphonic instruments and symphonic productions, and it can add huge amounts of body to your production. Try it. Take a guitar, record a guitar track, do some of the stuff we're talking about. Those 4 tracks, that one on the right, no detuning. The one on the left, detune at 3 cents. All right? Go over to the one on the right, the third one, and tune it up 3 cents. Then go back to the fourth one on the left, and detune that one 6 cents. And mess around with those detunings a little bit and listen to what it does. It adds so much body. You have to take time. It's very delicate work that you're working with. So sometimes you may not hear it, like it's some huge impact right away. But as you go along through your production, it does have a huge impact. I mean, you have any idea how 2 violins sound? And instead of, if I take this one violin and I make it exact same violin over here, all of them are the exact same, it's not going to have the same effect. You know why? First, there's a few reasons we've already talked about. They're going to be, this violinist is going to play to a couple milliseconds faster than this violinist, or a couple milliseconds slower. And this other violinist, the same thing, and his instrument's detuned a little bit or tuned a little bit high, plus or minus 3 cents or 5 cents or 4 cents, than the other violinist. It adds huge amounts of body, fullness to the mix and fullness to the sound. And you might not think so, just thinking about it, like, well, that's just plain wrong. Well, I guess, but it works. So you have to just kind of trust me on that and experiment with different instruments, different things that go on. Sometimes I won't use it. I got a synth going on. I'm not messing with that because of that sound. I'm not trying to make that Moog synth do that, bro. I mean, it's got this nasty, gnarly sound, and when I start doing too much of that, it sounds gnarly and muddy and yucky, and it's like, you really have to experiment and really understand you're dealing with something that it may not seem that way, but it's like dealing with chiffon. You really want to just work the waveform, and really spend the time experimenting and enjoying it. This kind of in-depth study and experimentation is, for somebody like this, some kind of, sound creation, nutcase guru that so he just loves it. He'll turn knobs all day long, messing around, trying to find this cool new sound. It's that kind of thing, bro. And just a little bit might do it. Well, how much is 0.1 billionth to add on there? That's it, bro. That's exactly what I was looking for. That kind of thing, bro. And so, and it will help. It does. So that's a huge lesson to get into your head. So that kind of panning thing, or that kind of detuning and uptuning, experiment with that. And the next thing we're going to talk about is different types of reverbs. This is a huge thing. Different types of reverbs. If you get an impulse response, if you get something like something simple here, like, what is that? REW. I'll use that to show people things sometimes. This is free Room EQ Wizard. To throw some of your impulses on there. Well, the impulse, you got someone that's a small room, that's not adding huge amounts of body, but just a little bit of presence and body to it, to where you can almost hear its reverb, and then you back off a little bit. So it's just adding body to it, okay? And, a different impulse is going to have a little bit different frequency response and a little bit different impulse response. So when you put that impulse response in there into your convolution reverb or something, that it's going to have those 2 different aspects to it. For sure. It might have different aspects that I don't know what got into your impulse response, but those 2 things are going to be happening positively. because you're looking at a room and you're recording this room. Well, it's got a different frequency response, early and late reflections, initial reflection thing, all that kind of stuff, things that it's bouncing off of that's going to contain total characteristics of the sound. That's the frequency response that works in conjunction with the impulse response. So putting a different reverb, you've got those two guitars, right? Off one right to left, you've detuned them, you've done some delay on one on the other, and then you put different impulse response from your convolution reverb on one than you do the other. Just a little bit different one. Does that make sense? Both of them that sound good, but a little bit different. And you bring them up to where they're not, you can't tell there's actually reverb. It's starting to sound like reverb a little bit, and then you back way off, you know, to where it's just adding body. And you put two different ones on each side. That's a huge thing. Those things that we talked about, and that's adding huge amounts of spatialization and to help you get a good full mix. Now, one thing that I want to talk about this is those things as far as the reverbs, those kind of things you have to be real careful about, and because those are very important. And to not, you know, if it a really good rule of thumb is you hear it, it's like I can hear reverb, back way the heck off, bro. You're trying to add body, because later on when you add some spatialization reverb to try to get a good full sound out of the mix, and you're looking at the mix and you go, the mix could use a little bit of reverb, just a tad, you know, just giving a little bit of space, you know, or, you know, the vocalist, after you've tried to mix everything together, you might add a reverb, you know, you go back and go, well, the vocalist could use a little bit more reverb. I mean, I got this cool impulse response with this good frequency response, and I'm going to start adding it into a little bit till it sounds really nice, got a little bit more body after the other work I've done. And after, you want to go light on that, because after that, when you get done with a full mix, you might add another reverb, you know, you know, at the end of the mix, that's for the whole mix, to add just a little bit of body. You know, I'm starting to hear reverb in the mix, back off. You just want to add body, unless it's for effect and I want reverb, you know, at this one part or something like that. Or who knows, you might have a production, I like reverb all the way through this thing. You know, that could be, but for the most part, you're just trying to add spatialization. So remember, it multiplies, so that when you're dealing with that, why I say go real light is because later you can always add more. You can always add more sugar to water. It's really hard to get sugar out. So go light. You can always add more later. You can always go back and do some more work on it. If you've done this work and you've bounced those files, you've rendered those files, and you're good to go, so you don't have a billion, you know, processors on your mix while you're going through there, that, you know, you didn't, you know, render it with too much. You know, you got more space, you got headroom. That means you can add a little bit more. You know, does that make sense? So go really light and really keep that. That's a huge concept to understand. So I certainly hope that helped a lot. You know, those concepts I just talked about will help you so much in getting a good full mix. And I did not sit here and give you some formula that do it like this, do it. There's all kinds of ways to do it. But, you know, I've learned one thing at the end of this that I want to talk about is different types of miking and using different rooms. First of all, different miking. I've used two different mics in different positions in the room to try to get this sound from this guitar or something. Well, what has happened? First of all, you've got a couple different things. The mic, the impulse response from it, the frequency response from it, which is EQ and reverb, and delays, is the only thing that's going to be different in there, except for the microphone might be adding some type of distortion. That's something totally different. That doesn't have anything to do with spatialization, adding body to your mix. Well, it will, distortion will, but that's a sound sculpting thing that we're not getting into in this short series about getting a good full mix. You have to go back and look at my videos on sound sculpting. So, you know, that different miking thing, if you get a good full sound from one track and you want to give yourself spatialization, make sure the capture's really good and you got a really good sound on it. You can EQ it, you can EQ, you can double the track and EQ one side different than the other. You can double the track and you can EQ, you can send one side off to the right and say, I've got actually 4 of these guitar tracks on here, but on the right hand side, 2 of them I've panned right. Now, the actual take that I made sounded really good, but I doubled the track, and coming up behind it, underneath it, I've boosted the high end a little bit because I wanted some more of that high end. Now, you can mess around with a mic trying to get it higher up on the fretboard or something, to try to get, a little bit more brassier sound. And if you can't get it you try it that way first, does that make sense? And you bring that up lightly behind it with a little more high end in it and see how that sounds. That's a really good spatialization thing. And adding body, because not only is it going to add body, and also when you're doing that, to be adding, working with that track, adding a little bit different delay or detuning to that also. Does that make sense? I mean, those concepts aren't exhaustive, but there's room for experimentation for you to sit down and go, well, what if I do that with that? I double that track and I do that, and I put this one behind it and make it quieter than the front track that's panned over to the right, and I put a little bit of delay on it, and I detuned it a little bit, and I actually panned with the first one that was 50% right, and the other one's like 75% right, and I changed the EQ and I put some high end on it so that it had a little more brassy effect, but it's quieter than the other guitar. I mean, it's not exhaustive, and it's got a little bit different reverb on there that's got a little bit different frequency response, and a little bit more different impulse response, room sound. That's not exhaustive, but it's, huge tools to work with to get a good full mix. And I'm telling you, if you experiment with that, you will be amazed. Just be careful. One huge thing to be careful of is getting a muddy bunch of messing with that. So just be careful. As you start to use it, be real careful that you don't all of a sudden go, I've done all this stuff and I sound like I got a muddy garbage, and it doesn't, I don't like none of that stuff. Well, it's probably because you're not using it properly. I mean, I've done this, when I first started messing it, I'd be going, well, that sounds great, and I get frustrated because all of a sudden I realized, no, I need to detune that one 2 cents. I needed to put that little teeny bit of delay over there that was just a little bit less than I had on there. I had put the reverb, I had too much on there or not enough, or I should have used a different reverb over there, or I mean, does that make sense? It takes experimentation and time, but the basic concepts are very simple and will help you immensely. And just remember, go light. Does that make sense? Go light. And it's going to take some time for you to work this all out to where you've got some good formulas to work with, to where when you start putting a mix together, you start doubling tracks and using delays and detunings and different reverbs on one side or the other for a little bit different frequency response, maybe EQing the track behind, doubling it and putting it behind the other one over to the right, and doubling it and putting it over on the other side that's EQ'd a little bit different. One of them's a little bassier, one of them's a little more tinny, or vice versa. One in the middle's got a little bit more mid-range, and to get a good full sound during that, it takes experimentation. And a lot of times that, you have to be real careful that, the muddiness is that when you're talking about muddiness, those shouldn't be so far out of each other, the frequency realm that started with that first guitar track. You shouldn't have a bunch of muddiness happening like it's all of a sudden went all over in the frequency spectrum. They should be fairly close together, just like this section of violins. Does that make sense? In the same concept, it just sounds full. It's got body, it's got girth, and it's got impact. And you're sitting in front of that section of 12 violins, and you're going, "Whoa, dude! Yeah, that is just so cool." Or cellos. I love sitting. I'll sit in front of cellos. I mean, 10 or 12 cellos. I love that sound. Or around you, it's just a cool sound, and it's from that kind of stuff. And spatialization front to back, messing around with that and really experimenting with that, bringing things up behind it quietly that sound off in the back that really don't sound like they're adding a lot, but they are. It's adding more, body to the mix, getting a more full sound. So I hope I tried to, this is like 40-minute video. I tried to keep that as simple as possible for you to experiment with it and to really have some fun with it and start getting a good full mix. And those were the two subjects that I felt would really help you get going in that direction. Focus on those two things that we've talked about in these series and the other things we talked about at the first video about getting a good full mix. And I think you'll be well on your way to a much fuller, better sounding mix. Peace, hope, love. Hope you enjoyed the series. See you in the next one.